In October 1982, during the White House press briefing, journalist Rev. Lester Kinsolving asked Reagan's press secretary what the president's thoughts were on the growing AIDS epidemic. The press pool burst into laughter. This was the reality of the AIDS crisis. Thousands of gay men were dying of an unknown disease, and the government just laughed as if it was a joke. These people had no say in how they were being treated, if they were even given treatment at all. This would have continued if LGBTQ+ activists did not rise up and fight for their rights, forcing the government's hand. The AIDS crisis is a terrible point in our history, but without it, the queer community would not be where it is today. HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, is an infection that attacks the body's white blood cells, weakening the immune system, making the body more susceptible to infections, certain cancers, and diseases. AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, is the most advanced stage of HIV. HIV and AIDS originated in Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of the Congo, in 1920, arriving in New York City in 1970 and spreading to California within a decade. In summer of 1981, health officials became aware of an unknown disease that was killing healthy gay men in New York City and Los Angeles. By January 1983, experts understood the gravity of AIDS and that it needed public attention. But the federal government did not just refuse to fund research for a cure. Reagan actually cut budgets for the CDC and National Health Institute. By the end of the year, there were over 4,700 cases and 2,000 people dead. By this time, people were starting to get angry. Their friends and family were dying, and the government was not making any moves to stop it. The gay rights movement was slowly gaining followers, but it was the AIDS crisis that really galvanized the LGBTQ+ movement. Up until the 80s, they had been fighting against discrimination, but now they were fighting for their lives. If they stayed dormant, they would die. In 1982, Larry Kramer founded ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. This was a militant organization fighting for accelerated research for a cure. Their protests were driven by anger. They would storm government offices with fake blood and handcuff themselves to politicians' desks. In 1988, ACT UP wanted the FDA to give them access to an experimental drug that could help patients with HIV and AIDS, but the FDA refused. So, on October 11th, ACT UP stormed the Food and Drug Administration in Maryland. They approached this protest more strategically, splitting into groups and moving in rows. The protest was a success and made national news. In a couple months, officials opened up access to experimental drugs. ACT UP created new norms in how diseases were treated and created a model for patient advocacy. They also accelerated the gay rights movement forward, forcing people to come out of their shells and fight for their lives. Without them, we would not be living in the same world. The AIDS crisis united people together, but also tore people apart. By 1985, there were 15,527 cases of AIDS reported and 12,529 deaths. In San Francisco, Cleve Jones wanted a way to honor all of those lost to AIDS. So Jones and volunteers created NAMES, a group dedicated to creating the AIDS quilt, a ginormous quilt covered in the names of people lost to AIDS. In 1987, NAMES leased an empty storefront and turned it into a workshop. They quickly began to make progress, with volunteers from all walks of life pitching in to help. On October 11, 1982, with the help of Nancy Pelosi, volunteers spread the panels on the National Mall. This was the first display of the quilt. It was visited by 500,000 people on its inaugural weekend display. In December 1988, NAMES traveled to 8 different countries to start a World AIDS Day, and in 1989, more than 20 countries started their own projects. Nancy Pelosi nominated Jones and NAMES for the Nobel Peace Prize for their global impact, and today the AIDS quilt rests in the National AIDS Memorial. It is too large to display, with over 500,000 panels, and is the largest piece of community folk art in the world. However, the AIDS quilt is not set in stone. It continues to grow. This is because the event it honors never ended. The queer community may not have come as far as it has today without the AIDS crisis. It was a terrible point in our history where many lost their lives. But the thing is, the AIDS epidemic continues on to this day. There is still no cure. The numbers are slowly decreasing, but not fast enough. In 2022, 630,000 people died globally of AIDS. That number would have been higher if it were not for heroes of the AIDS epidemic, the people who raised awareness to the crisis, before it was too late and fought against the neglect of our government.